agrees that Christopher Columbus discovered America in 1492, right? Or do they? Aside from the fact that it's impossible to discover a place where millions of people already live, there are some people who say that we have the history all wrong, that actually it was not Spain, but China that reached the Americas first, some 70 years before Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Really? If you were writing a research paper on the discovery of America, you'd be able to find all sorts of websites and blogs that make this claim, that long before the Columbus expeditions, the Americas were actually discovered by a Chinese admiral named Zheng He, whose fleet of ships, the largest the world had ever seen, had toured the Indian Ocean and the east coast of Africa, and then rounded the Cape, where it entered the Atlantic Ocean, and landed at South America in 1421. Wow. And these websites would lead you to a book called 1421, The Year China Discovered America, written by Gavin Menzies and published in 2002. Menzies' book was a bestseller, full of historical arguments and citations, and promising an exciting revision of everything that we thought we knew about the modern world. How cool would it be to base your research paper on this crazy new information, rather than the boring old story about Columbus that everyone already knows? A quick search on Wikipedia confirms that Zheng He was indeed a real historical figure, that he commanded the largest fleet in the known world in the 15th century, and that his treasure ships from China were the largest wooden ships before or since, dwarfing Columbus's puny Nina, Pinta, and Santa Maria. You're stoked, and you decide to quote and use Gavin Menzies' book 1421 in your paper and list it in your works cited page as one of your secondary sources. And yes, Gavin Menzies' book does fit the definition of a secondary source. If you recall from previous videos, secondary sources are sources written after the time period under investigation and are based on analysis of primary and secondary sources. Obviously, this book was written after the events he describes in 1421, and it does appear to be based on primary and secondary sources if you check out the citations and the footnotes in his book. There's only one problem. Gavin Menzies' book, 1421, is bad history. Although the book sold very well, becoming a New York Times bestseller, scholars easily demonstrated that his argument about China discovering the Americas was based on extremely weak evidence. So this brings us to a problem that has to do with secondary sources, and that is, how do we decide whether or not we have a good secondary source? Okay, why do secondary sources matter? Let's start by reviewing the two types of historical sources that we use when we do history. There's primary sources and secondary sources. As you know, primary sources are sources that were written in the time period under investigation. That is, their first-hand accounts. If you're writing about the year 1492, primary sources are from 1492. Secondary sources, on the other hand, are sources that were written after the time period under investigation, and those sources are based on the writer's analysis of primary and secondary sources. These are things like textbooks and books written about history, and there's tons of them. Obviously, primary sources are essential for doing history. Without first-hand evidence from the past, we have no facts to base our conclusions on. We can't know anything about the past without primary sources. But history is enormous, especially world history. If every person interested in understanding the past had to sift through and analyze only primary sources, it would be like they were reinventing the wheel over and over again. That's why secondary sources are so important. So much work has already been done by historians, by anthropologists, by archaeologists, and other scholars to gather and interpret primary sources to make arguments about what happened, how, and why, that any student of history needs to read this work in order to make sense of the primary sources themselves. Take the example of Christopher Columbus and his famous or infamous voyages across the Atlantic. If you were doing research on this subject, it would be crazy to start from scratch, searching for only primary sources, that is, letters and documents and diaries and official publications and speeches written in the 15th century. Even if you knew all the multiple languages required to translate these crucial documents, how would you know what those documents were referring to when they described events, ideas, people from more than 500 years ago? Are you already an expert on medieval Spain? Are you already an expert on the pre-contact Americas? Thankfully, historians have written millions of books. They've already covered so many areas of history, so many subfields of history, so many minute details about history, that the information is out there on almost any topic that you want to get started on learning about. But this is a benefit for you as a student of history. This benefit of so much information is also a major challenge because it's overwhelming. I'm sure you're familiar with that feeling of paralysis that comes over you when you start to research any topic and you become aware of just how much information is out there. And it gets worse every year. It was already bad enough when you had to enter a library and find books and materials that way. But now we have the internet. We have information just overload. Everything that you can imagine replicated in every kind of possible way. How are you supposed to know when you're doing a research what a good source is and tell the difference between that and a bad one? Even better, how do you find the perfect secondary sources for your research project? When you're looking for secondary sources for your history paper, you can't just Google a bunch of search terms and then just grab any old thing that comes up in the search. I'm not telling you something you don't already know when I say that the internet is full of noise. Just because something is written down or it's posted on a website doesn't mean it's legitimate, but you already know this. It is of course possible that when you've done this kind of Google searching, you've struck gold and hit upon a quality source, but you won't know that until you've evaluated it. Just as we saw in a previous video on primary sources, critical evaluation of secondary sources involves asking and answering questions. The most important question to ask when evaluating a secondary source is this: how credible is it? You need to determine if what you're reading is information based on solid evidence and skilled interpretation of that evidence. And so you don't waste any precious research time, you need to do this before you begin evaluating how useful the source is for your particular paper. Here's the #1 golden rule when it comes to evaluating a secondary source: know who wrote it. That means, first of all, making sure that the document has an identifiable author. Don't trust anything if you don't know who wrote it. Now, there are some exceptions like encyclopedias and dictionaries, but I can't stress this enough. If you don't know who the author of the information is that you're planning on citing in your paper, do not use it. Now, knowing the author is more than just knowing the name. After all, we know the author of 1491. His name is Gavin Menzies. But as I argued earlier, that was a really bad source for a history paper. Historians call it junk history. So how are you supposed to know who to trust? You're a college student. You don't have the time or the desire to spend hours and hours tracing the credibility of individual writers. So my advice is to trust the experts. What you're going to be looking for are sources, books, and articles that are written by people who know what they're talking about because they're experts in whatever the topic is, whatever the field. And history is a profession like any other. It has its experts, its professionals who are trained in how to do history. They're called historians. Now, some historians are good, some historians are bad. Historians always argue with each other, and some books kind of fall away and historical interpretations get old and out of date. But the reason why I tell you to trust historians when it comes to historical information and analysis is not just because I'm a historian and I'm looking out for my people. It's because historians go through extensive training to learn how to do history. And they spend years and decades mastering their field, becoming experts on everything related to their particular subject. If they go all the way through to the end, they get a PhD. That makes them an expert. And just like you wouldn't go to a doctor who didn't have some medical degree up on their wall, you really don't want to just, take the word of anybody about history who doesn't have some sort of expertise in the subject. A top historian of Columbus's invasion of the Americas, for example, would devote their entire career to learning everything there is to know about his life and his times. They would learn the languages required to translate primary sources. They would learn the problems of what we know and don't know about medieval Spain and pre-Columbian Americas. And they would be expected to be experts in what they're talking about. It's the professional reputation of historians depends on the accuracy and the rigor of their work. So when a writer writes an article or a book about their particular subject, it's put through an intensive process called peer review. That is, before it gets anywhere near publication and out into a journal or out into a manuscript, it's reviewed over and over again by other experts in the field for accuracy. And it's this rigorous process of peer review that means that when you finally get it in the form of a published book or an article in an academic journal, you know it's been rigorously put through this process of analysis for errors. Historians are by no means the only ones who write credible secondary sources, even for a history paper. Other professional scholars include anthropologists, archaeologists, sociologists, political scientists, all sorts of scholarly and academic professions, and they too are beholden to this process of peer review. And outside of academia, there are journalists and independent writers who have produced solid work on historical subjects, and they go also through a process of review whereby when a book comes out, that's by someone who's not a historian on a historian's historical subject, historians will then critique it for its accuracy. So reading reviews of secondary sources is a great way to determine credibility when you're thinking about using a secondary source. But do you have the time to dig through all the different reviews of every different book that you're looking at? Probably not. So the shortcut, that's why a shortcut is to trust the historians. With this trick, you would never have wasted your time with Gavin Menzies, because you would have discovered right away before you even began to consider this book that he's not a historian. He was a retired British submarine commander whose other published works as an author included a book about the lost empire of Atlantis. If you take only one piece of advice from this entire video about secondary sources, it should be this: know the author's credentials. Know who the author is and what their credentials are about the subject that you're looking to them for information from. When you find a book or an article that looks like it fits your topic, do a quick Google search to find out who the author is. Is that person a scholar? Does that person teach in a university department? Has that author published other works on this topic, making them an expert in their particular subject? These are the kind of things you want to figure out really quickly, and you can do this, in a matter of minutes. Here are some other questions that you should get the answers to right away before you waste your time on a potentially worthless source. Check the citations in bibliography. Are there a lot of citations? Do they look like they contain a lot of primary and secondary sources? Does the bibliography show that they've gone through a lot of different books and used them in making their argument? This is also really good to do too, because if you have a good secondary source, their bibliography will then turn you on to other good secondary sources. If it's an article, was it published in an academic journal or published on an academic website? Sometimes you can tell an academic website by the fact that it ends in .edu, making it an educational website. Academic journals there's tons of academic journals. Again, these are journals where articles that are written by scholars go through a peer review process, and they're very different than just blogs or things that you find on the internet. Another good thing to look for is the publication date. So was it recently published or is it very old? Historical analysis gets out of date. We find out new things about the past. We have new debates about the past. New information and angles are taken. So if you're reading a book, find a book from 100 years ago by a historian, a secondary source, it's going to be very different and kind of archaic compared to the most recent scholarship on the subject. So the more recent, over the past couple decades, that a book has been published, in a lot of cases that means that you have a stronger, more solid secondary source. And then finally, if you have some time and it's a book, read through the introduction. Find out what the author's thesis is, find out what their angle is. Sometimes the introduction tells you a lot about where the book is. It usually does, about where the historian is coming from and what kind of secondary source that you have in your hand. And then I would recommend, even if you're not doing it if you don't have to do it for a research project, create a little annotation where you answer all these questions for your sources, and that'll help you to go through the process of evaluation. The last thing I want to say on this is I know I've been given a lot of, pumping up to historians and like a historian patriot over here. But when it comes to critical analysis, your job is to be critical of everything, all the sources, all the pieces of information, ask questions all the time. And that includes when it comes down to historians. So my advice to you, even with that, is to have a critical, open mind.